She lived in a small town, where the streets were narrow and the houses close together, each with its own small garden or yard. Her life was simple and quiet. Every morning she would wake up before the sun, quietly slipping out of her modest room to prepare breakfast for her parents and younger siblings. The small house she lived in was old, with creaking wooden floors and walls that had absorbed years of stories and struggles. She never complained about the worn furniture or the thin curtains that let in the cold wind during the winter. To her, these were just parts of life, and life was about finding small joys even in hard times. Her family relied on her in many ways. She worked as a seamstress, sewing clothes for neighbors and sometimes for the small shops in town. She had learned the skill from her mother when she was very young. Threading needles and stitching fabric had become second nature to her, and she could create a dress or mend a torn coat with careful hands that rarely made mistakes. Even though the work was exhausting, she took pride in her craft. It gave her a quiet sense of accomplishment. People often praised her sewing, but she rarely spoke of her talent. For her, the satisfaction of a job well done was enough. Life in the town was ordinary, and she blended into the background like the soft colors of dawn. Most people barely noticed her, and some even thought of her as shy or dull. She did not dress in bright colors, did not raise her voice in crowded markets, and rarely joined the gossip that filled the town square. She was quiet, observing the world with gentle eyes, and that quietness sometimes made others think she had nothing to offer. But inside her there was a fire that few could see. That fire was her love for music. Music had always been her secret companion. She had found an old violin in the attic one rainy afternoon when she was 12. It was dusty and its strings were worn, but she felt an instant connection. She spent hours cleaning it, tightening the strings as best as she could, and then attempting to draw sound from it. At first, the notes were scratchy, uneven, and harsh, but she persisted. Every evening after finishing her chores and work, she would retreat to the small attic room, close the window to block out the noise of the town, and practice. Her family knew she liked music, but they never understood how much it meant to her. They had little money, and the idea of formal lessons was impossible. Still, she taught herself by listening carefully to music from the small radio her father had bought many years ago. Classical tunes, folk melodies, and occasional songs from distant lands flowed through the room at night, and she would try to recreate them on her violin. Sometimes her notes matched the music, and sometimes they fell short. Yet each attempt brought her closer to her dream of creating beautiful sounds. She did not practice for anyone else. It was her private world, a place where she could be free from judgment and expectation. When she played, she forgot about the cold floors, the tired hands, and the endless responsibilities. The bow on the strings became an extension of her emotions, expressing what words could not. Sometimes she played with such intensity that tears would gather in her eyes, and she would pause only when her fingers ached too much to continue. It was her escape, her joy, and her solace. Despite her dedication, life was not easy. The townspeople often overlooked her in conversations or dismissed her quietly. Some even mocked her for her quiet nature, whispering that she had no ambition and would remain nothing more than an ordinary girl. These words stung, but she refused to let them enter her heart. She had learned early that the world would not always recognize talent or kindness, but that did not mean she would stop pursuing her passions. She knew that what she loved was enough for her. Her days followed a rhythm that felt both comforting and tiring. She woke early, prepared meals, worked on sewing projects, ran errands for her family, and then spent the late evenings in the attic with her violin. Her hands often bore small cuts from sewing, and her back ached from long hours bent over fabric. But she welcomed the pain as part of the process. Pain, she had learned, was temporary. Passion, she realized, could outlast any hardship. Even the simplest moments held beauty for her. She loved watching the sunrise over the rooftops, listening to the birds that gathered in the trees outside her window, and feeling the soft breeze carry the scent of freshly baked bread from the bakery down the street. These moments reminded her that life, though difficult, was also filled with wonder. They inspired her music, and she often tried to capture these small joys in the notes she played. Her violin became a mirror of her inner world, reflecting both struggle and hope. The townspeople never suspected the depth of her talent. To them, she was just the quiet seamstress, the one who nodded politely in the market, the one who worked tirelessly without complaint. They did not know that in the privacy of her attic, She created music that could make hearts ache and eyes water. They could not imagine that beneath her simple appearance lay the soul of a musician, capable of moving anyone who truly listened. Occasionally, she would hum softly while stitching, letting fragments of melodies float through the air. Her mother sometimes paused to listen, smiling gently, but even she did not grasp the full extent of her daughter's gift. The woman's love for music remained her secret, a treasure she guarded closely, for she knew that the world could be harsh and unkind to those who dared to stand out. One rainy evening, she sat by the small attic window, watching droplets race down the glass. The town was quiet, the streets deserted, and only the faint glow of lanterns lit the way for the few who still walked home. She lifted her violin, feeling its familiar weight in her hands, and began to play. The first notes were tentative, testing the waters of her own courage. Then, as the bow danced across the strings, the sound grew bolder, richer, more alive. She lost herself in the music, forgetting the rain, the cold, the fatigue. Each note was a declaration, a small rebellion against a life that often demanded submission. Her music told stories without words. It spoke of longing, of dreams hidden behind quiet smiles, of hope that refused to fade even when the world seemed bleak. She imagined an audience somewhere, not her family or neighbors, but people who could truly understand the language of the heart. She played for them, for the invisible crowd that only existed in her imagination, and in those moments she felt powerful, free, and alive. The attic became her sanctuary, a place where she could explore every nuance of sound, every shade of emotion. She experimented with tempo and rhythm, sometimes playing slowly and deliberately, other times letting the notes fly in a flurry of excitement. She discovered that music could express what words could never capture. Joy, sorrow, love, fear, and triumph, all could be woven together on the strings of her violin. Though she lived simply, the richness of her inner life was immense. She drew strength from the knowledge that she had something precious that could never be taken from her. Her music was hers alone, untainted by ridicule or judgment. It was her rebellion against a world that often overlooked quiet people. Her testament that even the simplest individuals could hold extraordinary gifts. As she put down her violin that night, the rain still tapping gently against the window, she felt a deep sense of peace. Life would continue to be hard, people would continue to underestimate her, and her days would remain filled with chores and labor. But the music would always be there, a constant companion and a source of hope. She would continue to practice, continue to dream, and continue to nurture the gift that made her feel truly alive. She went to bed that night tired but content, knowing that tomorrow would bring more work, more challenges, and perhaps more dismissive whispers from the townspeople. Yet she also knew that no matter what the world thought, she had a secret power: her violin, her music, and her unwavering spirit. And that, she realized, was enough to carry her through anything that life might throw her way. Life in the town went on as usual, but the quiet peace of her days was about to change in a way she could never have expected. One afternoon, while delivering a batch of sewn clothes to a shop, she overheard the arrival of a wealthy family from a nearby city. They were known for holding extravagant gatherings, inviting the townspeople to attend, and often cruelly mocking those they considered simple or unrefined. At first, she paid little attention, continuing her work, but soon, whispers reached her ears about a challenge that would change everything. A neighbor, someone who knew of her secret skill, approached her with an awkward smile. They spoke carefully, almost too cautiously, hinting that the wealthy family had heard she could play the violin. The way they said it made her stomach tighten. It was one thing to enjoy music in her attic in private. It was another thing entirely to be called to a grand hall full of strangers, especially ones who had a reputation for cruelty. She felt a surge of fear. The idea that her passion might be turned into a source of ridicule was terrifying. Despite her hesitation, she found herself being invited, or rather summoned, to perform at the family's gathering. She tried to refuse, to explain that she was not ready, that she preferred to keep her music private. But the neighbor insisted gently, telling her that refusing might offend the wealthy visitors. She felt trapped between her fear and a sense of duty to the polite request. With a heavy heart, she agreed, hoping, naively perhaps, that it might be a small, harmless performance. When the day of the gathering arrived, she dressed in her modest clothes, feeling the weight of anxiety with every step. The journey to the Grand Hall was unlike anything she had experienced. The streets widened, the buildings became more ornate, and the air smelled different, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and expensive perfumes. She clutched her violin case tightly, as if holding it closer could make her braver. Entering the hall was a shock to her senses. Chandeliers hung from the ceiling, their crystals sparkling like frozen waterfalls. The walls were adorned with paintings of distant lands and people she had never seen, and the furniture was polished to a sheen that reflected the golden light. Servants moved swiftly, attending to guests who laughed and spoke in voices that seemed too loud and full of importance. She felt small, almost invisible, standing at the threshold of a world so far removed from the quiet streets of her town. The noble family greeted her with polite smiles, but she could sense the underlying amusement. There was a subtle tension in the air, a feeling that her performance was expected to be more of a spectacle than a demonstration of skill. She felt the weight of every eye in the room upon her, as though their gazes could pierce her very soul. Her heart pounded and her hands shook, but she took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She was led to a small stage at one end of the hall. The wooden platform gleamed under the chandelier light, and she could see the polished faces of the audience staring at her. Some whispered to one another, others smirked, and a few looked at her with polite curiosity. She set down her violin and opened the case, her fingers brushing over the familiar wood. It was her only comfort, the one thing that felt like home amid the unfamiliar grandeur. The first moments were the hardest. She stood there, bow in hand, aware that some in the audience were waiting to laugh. She closed her eyes for a brief instant, remembering the countless nights in her attic, the quiet hours of practice, the music that had become her refuge. She reminded herself that this was not about impressing anyone, but about being true to herself. That thought gave her a fragile courage, and she began to play. At first her notes were soft, almost hesitant, as if testing the waters of the room. She felt every eye upon her, every whisper, every tiny movement. But gradually the music grew stronger. The bow danced across the strings with a grace she had never felt so fully in her life. The sound filled the hall, soft at first, then swelling in richness and emotion. It was no longer a timid girl playing in an attic. It was a woman expressing everything she had kept inside, every hope, every fear, every longing. The audience, initially expecting clumsiness, began to shift in their seats. The smirks faded, replaced by astonishment. The music seemed to reach every corner of the hall, touching even the hardest hearts. Some guests leaned forward, caught in the beauty of the notes, their previous amusement replaced with awe. She played with abandon, letting the music speak for her, letting it convey what words could never do. Her fingers moved with a precision born of years of secret practice, yet the emotion behind every note was raw and alive. The melodies soared and fell like gentle waves, carrying the story of her life, the quiet struggles and the moments of private joy. The hall, meant to be a place of mockery, became a sanctuary of sound. The wealthy family, who had planned to ridicule her, found themselves unable to do anything but listen, their expressions changing from amusement to respect. For the first time, she realized the true power of her music. It was not about the grandeur of the hall, the wealth of the audience, or the expectations placed upon her. It was about connection, about touching hearts in a way that transcended social status, appearance, or past judgment. She closed her eyes, feeling the music flow through her, and allowed herself to be completely immersed in the performance. As she played, the whispers of mockery ceased. Some guests sat frozen, their hands resting on their laps as though afraid to break the spell. The music told stories of quiet nights, hidden dreams, and the beauty of simple living. The hall, which had been designed to showcase wealth and superiority, was now filled with something infinitely more powerful. Honest, heartfelt art that could not be bought or faked. The performance lasted longer than she had intended, but she did not notice the time. Her mind was entirely in the music, her fingers and bow guided by the emotions within her. When the final note lingered in the air, she felt a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She opened her eyes, unsure of what to expect, and found the audience completely silent. Even the noble family looked at her with expressions she could barely comprehend. Astonishment, admiration, and perhaps a hint of guilt for having underestimated her. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then slowly applause began, hesitant at first and then swelling into a chorus of appreciation. It was not the polite clapping of those who had endured a performance. It was genuine, heartfelt, and unrestrained. She felt a rush of emotion, a mix of relief and joy as the room meant to humiliate her now celebrated her talent. She stepped down from the stage, her hands still trembling from the intensity of playing. People approached her, offering words of praise she had never expected. Some thanked her for the beauty she had brought to the gathering, while others admitted they had been wrong to underestimate her. She felt a warm glow not from the attention, but from the realization that her music had reached others, had touched them in a way that words never could. As the evening ended, the wealthy family invited her to perform at other gatherings, this time out of genuine respect. She was hesitant to accept, unsure if she wanted to step into such a world again, but she realized that her music had opened doors she had never imagined, doors that allowed her to share her gift with a wider audience, without fear of ridicule. The town, which had often overlooked her, would now see a different side of the quiet seamstress who had always seemed ordinary. Returning home that night, she carried her violin close to her chest. The streets were dark and quiet, and the air smelled of rain and earth. Her family greeted her with curiosity and mild concern, asking how the evening had been. She smiled, not revealing all but letting them know that she had been brave and that her music had been heard. They did not need to understand everything. They only needed to see that she was alive with purpose and passion. That night in her small attic, she placed the violin on its stand and sat quietly, reflecting on what had happened. The fear that had gripped her earlier in the day had been replaced by a sense of empowerment. She had faced a room full of judgment and emerged not only unscathed but celebrated. Her secret world of music had proven itself stronger than the doubts and mockery of others. She realized that her journey was only beginning. There would be more challenges, more eyes watching, more expectations, and perhaps more fear. But she also knew that she had something that could not be taken from her. Her talent, her passion, and the courage to let it shine even in the face of uncertainty. And with that knowledge she drifted to sleep, dreaming not of the small streets of her town, but of the music that could transform the world around her, one note at a time. The memory of that first performance stayed with her, lingering like a soft echo in her mind. The moment she stepped onto the stage, feeling the weight of countless eyes upon her, had been terrifying yet exhilarating. Now back in her quiet attic, she held the violin gently in her hands, her fingers tracing the familiar curves as though seeking reassurance. She remembered the sound of the music filling the grand hall, the way it had silenced the laughter and whispers, and she felt a rush of pride. But there was also a new awareness. The world beyond her small town was waiting for her music, and it demanded courage she had never known she possessed. Word of her performance spread quickly. People in her town who had previously overlooked her now spoke in hushed tones of the quiet seamstress, whose music had stunned the wealthy family. Some were curious, wanting to see for themselves the woman who could transform a room with her violin. Others were skeptical, unable to reconcile the shy, modest girl they knew with the powerful musician they had heard about. She felt a mix of emotions, pride, yes, but also anxiety. She had not sought recognition, and the sudden attention felt overwhelming. Despite her reservations, the invitations continued. The noble family, genuinely impressed, asked her to perform at their upcoming events. Initially, she hesitated, unsure if she could handle the scrutiny and the fear of failing. But with each day that passed, the fear began to transform. She realized that her music had a voice that could reach beyond her small attic, and perhaps it was time to let it speak to more people. She practiced harder than ever, her bow moving across the strings with purpose and emotion, preparing for the next opportunity to share her gift. The second performance was different from the first. This time she walked into the hall with a quiet confidence, though her heart still raced. She could see familiar faces among the audience, some with skeptical expressions, others with anticipation. She lifted her violin, closed her eyes briefly, and let her music flow. The opening notes were delicate, drawing the listeners in with a softness that contrasted the grandeur of the hall. Slowly, the music grew, weaving a tapestry of emotion and beauty that captivated everyone present. This time, she allowed herself to take more risks with her playing. She experimented with tempo, played with pauses that held the audience in suspense, and added subtle variations that made the performance uniquely hers. The hall, filled with expensive decorations and opulent furniture, seemed to disappear as she immersed herself in the music. It was no longer a place for judgment or mockery. It became a world where only the sound mattered, where her passion could flow freely without interruption. The audience reacted in ways she had never imagined. Some leaned forward, eyes wide, completely absorbed. Others whispered to one another, amazed at the talent that had been hidden in plain sight. She noticed a few young children sitting quietly, their faces lit with wonder, perhaps imagining themselves one day playing music just as beautifully. It was a profound realization for her. Her music could inspire, not just impress. As she played, memories of her life flooded her mind. She remembered the long nights in the attic, the aching hands from sewing, the small moments of joy and sorrow that had shaped her existence. Each note carried a piece of her story, a reflection of the struggles she had faced and the perseverance she had shown. She realized that her music was more than just sound. It was a narrative, a way to communicate feelings that words could never capture. By the time the final note resonated through the hall, there was complete silence. Even those who had been skeptical or indifferent were captivated. Slowly, applause began, tentative at first, then building into a powerful acknowledgement of her talent. She felt a sense of fulfillment that she had never known. The music had connected her to the audience in a way that transcended social status, appearance, and expectation. She had shared a piece of herself, and it had been received with genuine admiration. The noble family approached her after the performance, their expressions sincere. They offered praise, not the condescending kind she had feared, but heartfelt acknowledgement of her skill and artistry. They invited her to perform at future events, suggesting that her music could be a highlight of their gatherings. She accepted, though cautiously, knowing that each performance would test her courage and resilience. She also understood that this was an opportunity to change perceptions, not just for herself, but for others who might feel overlooked or underestimated. Back in her attic, she reflected on the journey that had brought her here. She remembered the fear, the uncertainty, and the quiet determination that had carried her through. She realized that her music had always been her strength, a tool to navigate the challenges of life and to express the depth of her emotions. Now it was also a bridge, connecting her to a wider world and allowing her to touch the hearts of people she might never meet again. Her life began to transform in subtle ways. While she continued her work as a seamstress, she also embraced the new role of performer. She practiced with greater dedication, exploring new techniques and expanding her repertoire. Each piece she played was infused with emotion, reflecting not only her technical skill but also the depth of her experiences. She became more aware of the impact her music could have, not just as entertainment but as a source of inspiration and comfort. People in the town began to see her differently. The shy, quiet girl who had blended into the background was now recognized as someone extraordinary. Children watched her with admiration, imagining themselves following their own passions. Adults who had dismissed her before now sought her guidance and presence, curious about the woman who had turned fear into art. She did not seek attention or praise, but she accepted it gracefully, understanding that her music had created a ripple effect, changing perceptions and inspiring others. Despite the growing recognition, she remained humble and grounded. She continued to care for her family, manage her household, and work diligently as a seamstress. The fame and attention did not alter her values or her sense of self. Instead, they reinforced her belief that talent and dedication could shine, even in the most unlikely circumstances. She learned to balance the demands of her performances with the simplicity of her daily life, finding harmony between her public and private worlds. As the days passed, she received invitations to perform in other towns, each opportunity expanding her horizons. She felt a mix of excitement and nervousness, knowing that each new audience would challenge her in different ways. Yet she also felt a growing confidence, a realization that her music had the power to transcend fear, mockery, and doubt. Each performance became a testament to her perseverance and a celebration of the quiet strength that had always defined her. Through it all, she never lost sight of the reason she had begun playing the violin. It was not for fame, not for approval, but for the sheer joy of creating beauty and expressing the depths of her heart. Her performances were infused with authenticity, each note a reflection of her true self. And as she continued to share her gift with the world, she discovered that music had a remarkable ability to heal, inspire, and connect people in ways that words alone could never achieve. By the time she returned home after one particularly moving performance, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She placed her violin carefully on its stand, sitting quietly beside it. The experiences of the past weeks had been transformative, showing her that courage, dedication, and passion could overcome even the most daunting challenges. She realized that her journey was far from over, but she was ready to face whatever came next, knowing that her music would guide her and connect her to the world in ways she had never imagined. The day of the next performance arrived with a mixture of anticipation and nerves. She woke up early as she always did, performing her morning chores before turning her full attention to the violin. Her fingers traced the strings and the curves of the instrument, feeling the familiar reassurance of its weight and balance. She remembered the applause from the previous gatherings, the astonished faces of the audience, and the realization that her music could reach far beyond the quiet confines of her home. Yet this time there was a deeper pressure, an unspoken expectation that she could not ignore. She arrived at the venue, a hall even larger than the last one she had played in. The grandeur of the chandeliers, the polished floors, and the ornate walls was overwhelming, but she forced herself to focus. She reminded herself that the music was hers, that it belonged to her and to no one else. The eyes of the audience would not control the sound she produced. She took a deep breath, lifted the violin to her shoulder, and allowed herself to sink into the first notes. From the very beginning, it was clear that this performance would be different. She played with an intensity and precision that reflected months of practice and experience. Every note carried emotion, from quiet, reflective melodies to bold, soaring passages. She allowed the music to flow naturally, letting the story within each piece emerge as though it had been waiting all along to be told. The audience, initially quiet and attentive, began to feel the pull of her expression. Their curiosity transformed into fascination, and their expectation into admiration. The music painted vivid images in the minds of the listeners. They could feel the rhythm of her heartbeat in the gentle flowing notes, the tension of her struggles in the sharp staccato passages, and the moments of hope and triumph in the powerful crescendos. The noble family who had once intended to mock her now watched with wide eyes, unable to contain their astonishment. Guests whispered to each other, acknowledging her talent in hushed tones. And even those who had been skeptical were forced to confront the reality of her skill. She noticed small details that made the performance feel alive. A child in the front row leaned forward, eyes wide with wonder, while an older woman clasped her hands to her chest, clearly moved by the music. Some guests closed their eyes, letting the sound envelop them entirely. Each reaction reinforced her understanding that music was more than just sound. It was a language, a bridge between hearts and minds that transcended age, class, and expectation. As she played, memories of her journey surfaced. She remembered the nights spent in the attic, practicing tirelessly despite aching fingers and tired eyes. She remembered the ridicule of townspeople who had dismissed her as ordinary, the feeling of invisibility she had endured, and the private joy she had found in every note she produced. Now all those experiences were expressed through her violin, each movement of the bow a testament to perseverance, courage, and unspoken emotion. The performance flowed naturally, as if guided by an invisible force. She experimented with the music, adding subtle variations that made each piece uniquely her own. The audience was captivated, drawn into the ebb and flow of the melodies, the highs and lows of the harmonies. Even the noble family, who had intended her music to be a source of entertainment at her expense, could not help but acknowledge the authenticity and power of her expression. By the time she reached the final piece, the room was completely absorbed. The notes hung in the air, each one resonating with emotion, creating a space that felt almost sacred. When she finally lowered her bow, there was a moment of stunned silence. The audience needed time to process the depth of what they had just experienced. Then, as if a dam had broken, applause erupted, growing louder and more enthusiastic with every passing second. She felt a surge of gratitude and relief, a recognition that her music had touched lives in a profound and meaningful way. After the performance, the noble family approached her, their expressions sincere. They offered praise that was no longer tinged with amusement or condescension. They invited her to perform at other gatherings, acknowledging the impact of her talent and the respect it commanded. She accepted, understanding that this was not just an opportunity for personal recognition, but a chance to continue sharing her gift, to inspire and move others in ways that transcended superficial appearances. Returning home, She felt a mixture of exhaustion and fulfillment. The streets of her town were quiet, the familiar smells of food and earth welcoming her back. She entered her small house, greeted her family, and quietly set her violin on its stand. She did not need to explain the events of the day. They could sense the transformation, the confidence that now radiated from her. She felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her journey had brought her to a point where her music was no longer hidden, where it could be experienced and appreciated by others. That night, in the quiet of her attic, she reflected on the power of her own courage and the resilience that had carried her through challenges. She understood that her music had the ability to change perceptions, to challenge assumptions, and to inspire admiration. The fear she had once felt before stepping onto a stage had become a distant memory, replaced by a calm determination and an awareness of her own strength. She realized that her music was not just an expression of talent, but a reflection of her life, her struggles, and her unwavering dedication. In the days that followed, invitations to perform continued to arrive. She carefully considered each opportunity, balancing the demands of her performances with the responsibilities of her simple life. She remained devoted to her family and her work, understanding that her identity was rooted not in recognition or fame, but in the quiet, persistent love she had for her craft. Each performance became a way to connect with others, to share the emotions she could not otherwise express, and to remind herself of the power of perseverance. Through it all, she remained humble, grounded, and true to herself. The applause and admiration she received were welcome, but they did not define her. Her music was her own, a testament to the quiet determination and inner strength that had guided her through life. She continued to practice with diligence, exploring new pieces, refining her technique, and deepening her understanding of the emotional resonance of each note. She began to notice changes in the people around her as well. Children who once ignored her now watched in awe, inspired to pursue their own passions. Adults who had dismissed her abilities began to seek her guidance and insight, curious about the woman whose music had transformed their perception. The town, once indifferent to her quiet presence, now held a sense of respect and admiration for the seamstress who had quietly nurtured a remarkable gift. Despite the growing recognition, she never lost sight of the joy and solace that music had always brought her. Each time she lifted the violin, she remembered why she had started, the nights of secret practice, the moments of triumph and frustration, and the deep connection she felt to every note. Her music remained a personal sanctuary, a space where she could express herself fully and authentically. As she lay down to rest that night, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. Her journey had been difficult, filled with challenges, doubt, and fear, yet she had emerged stronger, more confident, and deeply connected to her purpose. She understood that her music was not only a gift to herself, but a bridge to others, capable of evoking emotion, inspiring courage, and creating beauty in a world that often overlooked the quiet and unassuming. And with that understanding, she drifted into sleep, ready to face the days ahead with her music as her guide and her heart as her compass. The recognition she received from her performances gradually extended beyond the noble family and her town. Invitations came from nearby villages and cities, each one an opportunity for her to share her music with new audiences. Though the thought of performing in unfamiliar places was daunting, she accepted with a quiet determination. She had learned that fear was natural, but it could be transformed into strength when faced with courage and preparation. Her life began to balance in a new way. She continued to care for her family and manage her household with dedication, but she also devoted time to practicing for her upcoming performances. Every morning after completing her chores, she would sit with her violin, exploring new melodies and refining old pieces. She experimented with techniques, allowing her music to evolve and deepen. Each note she played carried the essence of her experiences, her emotions, and her story. Traveling to different venues brought new challenges and insights. In each hall, she encountered diverse audiences, some skeptical, others curious, and a few openly critical. Yet she discovered that the sincerity of her music could break down barriers. Even those who had never heard her before, or who had preconceived notions about her abilities, were often moved by the authenticity and emotion in her performance. It became clear to her that music was not merely entertainment. It was a language of the soul, capable of connecting hearts across distances and differences. In one small village, She arrived to find a modest gathering of townsfolk, many of whom had never seen a violin before. She felt the familiar pang of nervousness, but reminded herself that her purpose was not to impress but to share. As she played, the villagers' faces transformed from curiosity to awe. Children stood still, eyes wide, some reaching out as if they could touch the music itself. Adults whispered to one another, captivated by the beauty and depth of her sound. The music seemed to bridge the gap between her simple life and the grandeur of her talent, creating a shared experience that everyone felt. Through these journeys, she began to understand the wider influence of her music. She noticed that people were inspired not only by the melodies she played, but also by her presence, her quiet confidence, and her perseverance. Many approached her afterward, expressing gratitude for the emotion she had shared, telling her that her music had brought comfort, joy, or even hope. These encounters filled her with a profound sense of purpose. She realized that her talent had the power to uplift and encourage, to bring light to those who had forgotten how to dream. At each performance, she maintained her humility. She never sought applause or praise for its own sake, but allowed the audience to respond naturally to the music. She remained grounded in her simple life, cherishing the daily routines that kept her connected to her family and community. The contrast between her modest existence and the recognition she received reinforced her understanding that true value comes not from status or wealth, but from dedication, authenticity, and the willingness to share one's gifts. Her influence began to extend beyond performances. In the towns and villages she visited, children who had once been hesitant to explore music now showed interest, inspired by her example. Adults began to encourage young talents, recognizing the transformative power of nurturing skills and passions. Slowly, she realized that her music had become a catalyst for positive change, inspiring others to embrace their own abilities and follow their dreams. This realization filled her with quiet satisfaction, a sense of connection that extended far beyond the notes she played. Despite the growing attention, she remained committed to her personal growth as a musician. Each new piece she learned, each new venue she played in, brought opportunities for self-discovery. She experimented with new styles, explored different compositions, and reflected on how her life experiences shaped the music she produced. She realized that her journey as a musician was ongoing, a path of continuous learning, exploration, and self-expression. There were moments when doubt crept in, as it always does. Travel fatigue, the pressures of performance, and the occasional skeptical audience could weigh heavily on her spirit. Yet she discovered that these challenges only deepened her understanding of herself and her art. She learned to draw strength from adversity, to channel uncertainty into expression, and to trust in the sincerity and passion that had carried her this far. Each challenge became an opportunity to grow stronger, both as a musician and as a person. As her reputation grew, she began to perform in larger towns and small cities, encountering more diverse audiences. Each concert was unique, influenced by the space, the people, and the atmosphere. Yet in every setting she maintained the same focus: to communicate through her music, to convey emotion and truth, and to share a part of herself with those who would listen. The power of her performance lay not in showmanship or spectacle, but in the authenticity of her expression, the honesty that resonated through every note. Over time, she found that her music had created a network of connections. People who had heard her play would share stories, recommend her performances, and express how her music had touched their lives. The small girl who had once practiced in solitude in a dusty attic had now become a source of inspiration and admiration. Yet she never allowed this recognition to alter her essence. She remained grounded, appreciating each day, each note, and each opportunity to perform. Her family, too, witnessed the changes. They saw the quiet pride in her eyes, the growing confidence in her posture, and the joy she carried home after each performance. They supported her wholeheartedly, understanding that her gift was not simply a skill but a part of her identity, a source of fulfillment and purpose. The balance she maintained between her responsibilities at home and her musical endeavors allowed her to remain connected to her roots, while also embracing the wider world that her music had opened up. In her final performance of the season, she played before an audience that included both familiar faces and new admirers. The hall was filled with anticipation, and as she lifted her violin, she felt the familiar surge of nerves mixed with excitement. As the first notes flowed, The audience was immediately drawn into the music, experiencing the depth and beauty of her expression. She moved through the pieces with fluidity and emotion, each note resonating with the journey she had undertaken, the struggles she had faced, and the triumphs she had earned. The applause at the end was overwhelming, not just in volume but in sincerity. She felt a profound connection with the audience, a recognition that transcended words. In that moment, she understood that her music had become more than a personal passion. It had become a shared experience, a gift that could move hearts and inspire courage. She smiled quietly, aware that she had achieved something remarkable, not through wealth or privilege, but through dedication, authenticity, and the quiet strength that had always been her guiding force. Returning home once again, she placed her violin in its stand, reflecting on the journey that had brought her from the small attic of her modest home to the stages of towns and cities beyond. She realized that her life had been transformed, not by external recognition alone, but by the courage she had found within herself, the commitment to her passion, and the willingness to embrace her talent despite fear and uncertainty. Her music had given her a voice, a purpose, and a connection to the world that she had never imagined possible. She understood, finally, that the true power of her gift lay not in the applause or the invitations, but in the ability to touch hearts, to inspire others, and to express the depth of human experience. Her journey had proven that even the simplest life, lived with passion, dedication, and authenticity, could create beauty that resonated far beyond the individual. And as she settled into the quiet of her home, she felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that her music would continue to guide her, connect her to others, and leave a lasting impact on the world around her.